Welcome to this podcast. In this podcast, I'd like to talk about Saturn's placement in the 4th house or in the sign of Cancer. Now, if you would like natal chart synthesis, then all my details are in the video description. Because you may enjoy these podcasts, but these podcasts are not descriptive of your personality. That's like describing the ingredients used to make a meal. Now, the meal is made up of all the ingredients, so the meal is the total of tastes or flavors contained within all the ingredients. The act of cooking is the act of mixing things together in proportion or in measure to deliver the final taste or the final flavor or whatever you want to call it. So until you have a natal chart synthesis, it is quite impossible to delineate your mission on this planet, your mission on Earth, your mission as a human being, your life story. And why is your life story important? Because without your life story, you don't know anything about what you are or who you are. You don't know what you're here to do, and you don't know what you're supposed to do for work. You don't know what you're supposed to do for money. You don't know what you're supposed to do for marriage, for relationship, for love. You don't know. And in the absence of not knowing, you begin to guess. That's basically what it is. You begin to navigate this void, and then you make mistakes. And sometimes making mistakes is part of your life story in that sense, because despite the fact that we are not consciously aware of the life story in that sense, it doesn't mean that we don't have strong intuitive faculties that somehow at a very deep level of ourselves understands what it's here to do. Now, the advantage of natal chart synthesis is that it brings those depths to the fore. It gives words to things that you may already know at some level, but couldn't quite articulate it. Okay? That's really what it is. Because nobody else can tell you about yourself. You being yourself, you know yourself better than anybody else. So the idea is that this knowledge is somehow within you in a form that cannot really be expressed. It cannot really be accessed by the will. And so what natal chart synthesis does is to synthesize, based on the placements in your natal chart, to synthesize a unitary life story, which is all-encompassing in the sense that it presents to you a narrative, a singular narrative that encompasses why you are here. Because that narrative will be able to explain all your drives, all your desires, why you act the way you do, why you make the choices that you do, what you're hiding from, what you're running away from, what you're running towards. Okay? Because that's what astrology codes for. It doesn't really code for physical things. Now, it doesn't mean that physical things aren't the manifestations of these root drives and desires. But you don't find astrology coding for actual physical houses. Or you have this placement in this placement, which means you're going to have a big house. I don't know what this is, but it's very hard to call that astrological thinking. Okay? You have this placement and this placement, so you're going to like eating strawberries. What does this mean? It doesn't mean anything, really. Why? Because you can't do anything with it. And the entire point of synthesis is that you get information which empowers you. And you can tell by yourself if it's true or not, because, it is you being described. No, we're not describing somebody that is alien to you. We're describing you. And it's you from the very beginning, even before you became human. So that what you hear in a synthesis is something that is the most familiar thing. It sounds so familiar. Why? Because it's literally you. It's just connecting the pieces. In other words, we're connecting memories that have been suppressed or repressed. And we're bringing them to the fore so that it empowers you to take better control, in inverted commas, because what is control anyway? It just makes you more aware of yourself. Because there are some aspects of our behaviors that puzzle us. We don't know why we do what we do. It's not that we don't know. We don't want to know. And it is in that sense that natal chart synthesis can be powerfully revealing in that sense. Because, there's some aspects of ourselves that we don't know about because we don't want to know about it. Because when we know about it, it forces us to confront that aspect of ourselves. And there's a reason why we don't want to confront it. It's because we're in denial. Okay? And denial is a temporary band-aid. What it does is it pushes the date for the revelation of whatever it is that is being denied. It pushes it further down the line, where it gathers momentum, because that's all it does. It doesn't go away. It just gathers momentum. It becomes more difficult to confront with time. And so it just pushes this confrontation date further into the future. But confrontation must happen. Why? Because that's the reason why you came here. That's the reason why you are a vessel in this physical existence. Okay? It's the reason why you've chosen to play the role that you're playing. And so the technique is to deliver this, especially when it comes to very sensitive areas, to deliver this as, I would say, as pleasantly as possible, or as gradually as possible, to build it up as a narrative, because the aim is not to create guilt or shame. Absolutely the opposite. The aim is to free the individual from these things so that they can be more of who they are, who they really are, without shame, without guilt, without any explanation to anybody, really. Okay? Because the way to look at it is to look at yourself as you are staring into a universe. Now, most of that universe is unknown. And all of that universe, both the known and the unknown, is you. But you're staring into it. You're basically conscious of it. So what that simply means is that there is an aspect of your total awareness that is growing and expanding. There's an aspect of it that you know of, that you are aware of, which you call yourself. Your knowledge, your science, your stories, your religion, your faith, your will, your focus, your self-consciousness, your self-awareness. There are many names for this. Then there's an aspect of you that you don't know anything about. And there's an aspect of you that you don't know anything because you don't even know that it exists. And that is the eternal, infinite reach of space-time. That's really what it is. Now, the entire point of natal chart synthesis is to begin the process of collapsing this space. To start drawing you in from all of those extensions and start bringing you back in some sense. Because it means that you are now reconnecting with different aspects of yourself. And so the entire process is one that generates an extreme amount of familiarity. Now, this is in stark contrast with the way that astrology is peddled in the mainstream today. Now, I don't have any problems with those approaches in the sense that if you want them and if you feel that that is what is right for you, then go for them by all means. But if you are one of those people, and there's a reason why you have certain types of people always seeking the deeper understanding. The reason why they do that is because there is a hunger within them, a hunger that nothing superficial will satisfy. They desire true understanding and true meaning of themselves because they desire a true understanding and true meaning of the universe. And that means that these people often have a stronger or higher sense of the need for intimacy within them. But these things are one and the same. The hunger is one and the same. It just manifests in different forms. Okay. They desire a connection that is almost absolute. They want something closer, much closer to the truth. And so it is no wonder that most of the people who seek a deeper meaning in everything, they're mostly Scorpios or people with significant placements in Scorpios or the 8th house. That's not a coincidence. Okay. So in this particular podcast, we're going to be talking about the 4th house because the 4th house, the 8th house and the 12th house, they form part of one aspect of the narrative because these are the emotive houses. And there's a reason why they come at the end of the quadrant that begins with a fire house. And then you move into an earth house. And then you move into an air house. And then you finally end with an emotive house. And what that tells us is that our emotions as human beings is a synthesis of these houses that preceded them. And so, in today's reality, in modern reality, we tend to prioritize the intellect above all else. It's a quantocentric world or a quantitative world. No, that's not how human nature works. You see, the emotive expression of a human being is one step further in the processing than the intellectual aspect of a human being. Because your emotions contain more. It's a higher level form of processing reality. Okay? Because it is on that emotional level that you are truly distinct. Because computers can do quantitative stuff, computers are employed everywhere in the world now. It's almost like we went backwards rather than forwards, because we went from the emotive state and started depending more on the computational intellectual state to run our society. And you think that's progress? It's not. That's really what it is. It's not progress. It doesn't make the world a better place. Rather, it leaves the human with something, as if something is missing, because everything feels so cold. Processes, computers, they run the world, right? And now the human being is subject to processes that the human being is beholden to. And that is a reduction of status. And so the human being is in a state of bondage. That's really what it is. Just that most people don't realize that that is what is happening. Okay? In a state of bondage, because you now are beholden to a system that does not value the essence of what you are as a human. Now, the base of this emotive faculty is the fourth house. That's what the fourth house really is. It is the root of this emotive faculty that starts in the fourth, or in the sign of Cancer, is in the intermediate form, the more difficult form, in the 8th house or in the sign of Scorpio, and then tapers off in the 12th house or in the sign of Pisces. Now, there's a reason why the 8th house or Scorpio is the more difficult form. It's because of the task that needs to be performed there and the vantage point, the datum from which we approach this task. It's not that Scorpio is inherently difficult. It's the reference frame where we stand to approach this. And usually that damage is done in the 4th, you see, because the 4th is where the sense of self is woven together. And there's so many processes beyond the actual control of the human that weave these aspects of the self together. Now, if for any reason those processes are somehow impaired, then the human being has a faulty foundation. And so the cathedral of the emotive self that is usually built on this 4th house is also impaired. And so when you find it difficult to be able to bond with another human being in honesty and intimacy, it's because the foundations are usually faulty. Okay? Some people just go straight to the 8th house or to the sign of Scorpio to look for the problem, but that's not where the problem usually lies. And it's why some astrologers connect the 4th house to mother or father or the primary parental figure. But like I said, astrology doesn't code for things. Okay, the need of the 4th house is to deliver a well-threaded and well-woven personality structure that has a foundation that is understood and known. That foundation that is understood and known, it is the internalization of truth. And like I've said, since all knowledge is self-knowledge, then all truth is self-truth. So these are aspects of the psyche that connect to the reason why you are here. Because once you know that, and once you understand that thoroughly, then that forms the foundation upon which you can now launch yourself into what you consider to be the world or to your reality. Okay? And when things go wrong there, it means that the individual doesn't have a leg to stand on, so to speak. Have a faulty foundation. And this faulty foundation shows up as an individual who doesn't know who they are or who cannot accept who they are. And once you cannot accept something, then you go into denial. So denial is inherently a 4th house phenomenon. Because the first thing that is denied is the concept of the self. The interwoven and well-knitted or well-threaded self. Now, where does this development take place? Because the 4th house is symbolic of a womb. And the only reason why it is symbolic of a womb is because that's the deepest part of the psyche. It's like the floor of the psyche, so to speak. Okay? And it offers a sense of balance. It offers an environment that is conducive for development. And so the aim of the 4th house is to take away the topsy-turviness that the 3rd house is really known for. Because the 3rd house, which is the house of Gemini naturally, is a house where contrasts are generated. Now, the aim of a contrast is to create a dynamic that flips 180 degrees. It's an opposition of some kind. And oppositions contain the greatest dynamics in the natal chart, also in your personality, because it represents two aspects of the psyche that are diametrically opposed to each other, even though they form part of a unity. And so they allow us to do things, because that dynamism is a source of energy. Hence why it seduces modern society into its allure, because obviously you want to be able to achieve more with less in terms of computers and processes and all that. Okay? But the reality of the matter is that this should not be at the expense of the emotive self, because the emotive self is a higher evolved form than the intellectual self. A lot of people don't want to hear this, but that's the truth. Okay? You are better off as a feeling creature than as a robot. That's really what it is. So the fourth house is the process of restoring equilibrium from this opposition. And it does this by calming the waters, tending to the ravaging sea, literally like pouring oil on frothy waters. So it is a place of peace. It is a place where peace is absolutely necessary to calm the fears of vulnerability. And when things are impaired in this house, then whether the individual knows it or not, their greatest and primary problem is fear. The fear of being vulnerable. And vulnerable creatures, they feel very alone. They go into a threat detection and threat avoidance mode, which now instructs them to build shelters, to build protective layers. It is why the sign of Cancer is symbolized by a crab. Because the crab essentially is a creature that has built its skeleton on the outside of it, because it's too afraid. Okay, it's a very soft-bodied creature, and so it feels very vulnerable. It feels too vulnerable. So it hides this sensitivity by constructing its shell on the outside. And that way it can go about interacting with the world as it perceives it. And this symbolism was used because it was noticed that this is a similar type of behavior to fourth house personalities, or people who have significant placements in the sign of Cancer or in the fourth house itself. They tend to build protective shells. Why? Because the self is vulnerable with its internal nature. It feels too exposed. And that is the process of keeping certain aspects of yourself to yourself. Now, when I said that it is symbolic of a womb, it is because this process of internalization and protection usually creates an environment that nurtures, that allows for the gradual development of a psyche. So every protective environment, every environment that does this is similar to what the fourth house connotes. Because the gift of the fourth house is self-acceptance. And the self-acceptance is not a belief system. It's not a willful system. It is a transactional dynamic, really. That's the best way to explain it. It is a transaction that is taking place before the birth of the ego, before the birth of the will. So every transaction is a process of give and take. You give me something, I give you something. Okay? So it's an exchange mechanism in some sense. Now, what is traded is fear is traded for comfort. Fear is traded for protection. That's really what it is. So that the one who is frightened and feeling vulnerable receives some type of assurance from the transactional dynamic. And based on this assurance, the person is allowed to grow in a peaceful, calm, secure way. And what they are gestating within themselves is the ego. Because when this gestating period, secure period, reaches its end in terms of what develops or what emerges from this chrysalis, is an ego. That's how Leo comes from the sign of Cancer. You know, these are the things I teach in very detailed form in my classes, because I really go into the narrative of how it works. I'm summarizing everything here, but there is a basis upon which this entire thing is built. It is the basis that reveals to you your life purpose, because you understand the dynamic. It's like looking at the flow of a stream, how it flows into a river and how that river drains into the ocean. You know the source, you know the end. That way you can plot a map of some kind, of like a full picture. That's really what it is. So the fourth house, this internalization process, is symbolized by the primary caregiver. Either mother or father, depends. You know, today any parent can play that role in that sense, but the natural implementation of this symbolism is mother. It's mother. So that mother's gift to a child really is self-acceptance. And it is based on how mother accepted the child. That's really what it is in summary. And then with this self-acceptance, the child builds conviction. And what is the conviction? The child is able to tell what is true and what is false. That's really what it is. And the telling is not based on some type of willful experience or some type of belief system. No. You see, the psyche is more complex than that. At that level of the fourth house or the sign of Cancer, there is an aspect of knowing, a choosing mechanism that is able to tell what is true based on evidence. But the evidence gathering process takes place before the individual is aware of it. Before the individual is making a conscious choice. It has already decided on what's true or what it's going to do or something like that. So that if the individual ultimately decides that they're going to deny this experience, then they go into denial. And that process of going into denial is the process of self-negation. It's a process that works against conviction. And its job is to split the developing ego into two. That when it emerges, it carries the duality that was found originally in the third house or in Gemini. The self is conflicted. And so there is a necessity to defend the ego. And so Leo in that condition, once it emerges in such a duality, is antagonistic to itself. And it must now replicate that antagonism as conflicts. The inability to get along with others, or what it calls others. And that begins to happen in the sign of Libra. Because Libra now becomes the screen upon which these projections that come from the fourth house or the sign of Cancer, they're now projected on the screen of Libra, which is where the negotiation with what you consider to be external reality begins. It's a very important process, very crucial. Now, because the ego is antagonistic to itself, alright, so it undergoes an unconscious process of building itself up and tearing itself down. And that's when you begin to see Leo as being bashful or boastful or whatever. Okay? Because that is a way of undoing its own ego, because the ego doesn't need to do that. It is what it is. The very fact that it is what it is, that's what drives it. And so it begins to search its ideations of reality for images of itself. And anytime it finds that, it delights. That joy is its recompense. But when the self is split because of what has happened in the fourth house or in the sign of Cancer, then a kind of inauthentic ego is born. But at the root level of that ego, at the base level of that ego, is the original doubt, the original self-negation, the original anti-convictions. And so the individual hides this. Now, the only way you know it's there is when that ego begins to defend itself against things that look like attacks. And then the sensitivity is revealed. Okay? That's really what it is. And when this now goes further, evolves further, by the time it gets into Scorpio, it's a disaster waiting to happen. That's really what it is. A huge disaster. Because the process of undoing shows up in Scorpio as very painful realizations within relationships that transform the life of the person. Now, the idea is that Pluto is the kind of gatekeeper, because Pluto rules Scorpio, and the 8th house, in essence, is the kind of gatekeeper that cannot allow you cross with such an inauthentic representation of yourself, especially if there are many functional lights or planets tied into the 8th house or various aspects of Scorpio and Pluto, because the consequences are disastrous. So it breaks everything down, reveals you to be a kind of fraud to yourself, that is, because the only one that you can deceive is yourself. It is impossible to deceive other people. That's really what it is. Most people don't know this because they think that they're others. I mean, you're standing looking at the world. I started the conversation by saying you are the one looking at the entire world. You are the one observing your reality. So when you go deceiving that reality, who exactly are you trying to deceive? You're only deceiving yourself. All deception is self-deception, because every single thing in your field of experience as a human being is being generated by you. After all, you're observing what is in your head. You don't know what it is like to be another person. Why? Because that person is an aspect of your own experience. It's not you in that sense. Okay? So you feel disconnected from it. So you don't know what it is like to be another person. So you see a universe that is somehow separate from you, even though it is you. An example I often use is that you are the cells that make up your liver and your kidney. That's who you are. But in some other sense, it's not you because you're not in direct contact with them. You are not aware of yourself on that level, and yet it is all you. So that every human being that you meet in your field of experience really is an aspect of you that you don't currently know anything about, but you would like to get to know. You want to figure out, you want to connect these spaces together. So that if you can connect all the spaces together, then there are no 8 billion people on the planet. There's only you. Do you realize what a transformation in understanding that is? Because you wouldn't want to hurt you now, would you? Of course not. And so why would you be able to hurt another? It's because you think it's another, somehow separate. This is why it is very dangerous to put Gemini before Cancer, to put the 3rd house before the 4th house, to intellectualize the world in that sense. All right? Because once you do that, then you create these polarities, because the polarities are how we understand things, basically. We create a contrast. That contrast is a distance. It's a distance between two extremes. It is the essence of an opposition. Oppositions are conflicts. And the only way oppositions can be sustained is by sustaining conflicts. But the primary conflict is between you and another, because that is the primary representation between you and God. And that is the representation. The distance that is in that representation is what must be collapsed. Otherwise, the human being is at war with itself. It cannot know peace. And I've told people many times, peace is not an absence of war. Because the absence of war is a surrender of some kind. Somebody somewhere has surrendered. True peace is the absence of the concept of war. The concept of a conflict. The concept of an opposition. And what that simply means is that this contrasting process found in Gemini, the distance must be resolved. And that is going from the duality of Gemini to the unitary nature of what? The sign of Cancer. It's going from Libra to Scorpio. It's going from Aquarius to Pisces. Because these air signs, they contain the essence of dualities. Okay? Because we need them for understanding. But it is our understanding that needs to evolve, because the aim of that understanding is to seduce us into a distance, into a metric that allows us to calibrate what we now come to understand as a space-time. But there's no such thing. There is none. And the evidence for that is so simple that it eludes almost everybody. Why? Because it's extremely simple. I mean, go outside and stand and look around you. Look at the world around you. What I'm saying is that that world that you are looking at, the entirety of it is your experience and is as private as anything else. That's how you sense it. It's your experience. Now, when you call another human being and you say, I'm experiencing the world, are you experiencing the world the same way? And the human being says, well, I'm experiencing the world in my way. I don't know if the way I'm experiencing the world is the way that you're experiencing the world too. And so we begin to seek common grounds in terms of, do we experience the world the exact same way? That process is what Libra is. This process of negotiating of, do we experience the world the same way? Because the aim is to merge. And what we are merging is the sense of self. What it is like to be me. Now, if you and if other people are a phenomenon in your experience, and you are a phenomenon in other people's experience, that is the definition of self-similarity. That is the definition of a fractal. And if you know anything about fractals, you know, one good example of a fractal is the Mandelbrot set. In other words, you're experiencing self-similarity at all scales. And remember what I told you about the prime signal. There's a reason why the prime signal exists. The aim of the prime signal, and if you don't know what the prime signal is, then there are a few podcasts that I have that describe in summary, that is, what the prime signal is, because the full description of what the prime signal is, I restrict that to my membership videos. Okay? I have 3 podcasts that focus on the prime signal, that behind my membership criteria. So, the essence of the prime signal is to connect all scales together in a seamless manner, so that you can go from the highest possible scales, whatever that means, to the lowest possible scales, whatever that means. The reason why I say whatever that means is because these things don't really exist. Okay? But as physical beings, this is the nature of our experience. So we go from the astronomical scale or the cosmological scale where things are perceived to be the largest sizes, so grandiose, we cannot even comprehend their grandiosity. And then we go to the smallest possible scales where you have the fundamental constituents of matter, right? All those scales are connected by what I call the prime signal. It's really a K pattern. That's the way that I name it. Okay. I actually named all these things because I invented them in that sense while studying for the principles of organized complexity. Okay? Because that same prime signal is what you are as a human being. That's what you are processing. That's why you are self-aware. That's why you can experience self-awareness. Is because at some point in time, the matter in your head or the constituents of your brain, they began to mimic this organization. And so you are carried along, because that's what self-consciousness really is. The opportunity to be carried along with creation. So you observe what is going on. The goat doesn't have that complexity, so it doesn't know what is going on. And as a result, it doesn't know what it is. And it doesn't know that it doesn't know what it is. So it is unburdened by that pressure. Okay? The foundation for all of this is what the fourth house is really concerned with. Because it is the root on which this edifice is built. It is the gift of what you call a family. And it's called a family for a reason. It comes from the word familiar. Why? Because you are born into circumstances. Your story of physicality starts with physical circumstance that constrain your trajectory for growth, for self-knowing. That's why people are born into different types of families. They emerge from those families as representatives of those families in that sense. So that the family really is like a molding vessel, like a container. And they create and mold another container, another vessel, which is you as you emerge. And so the gift of that emergence is what you call the ego. That's really what it is. The ego's primary job is to become aware that it is being carried along on this trajectory that connects all scales of existence together. So it is the primary pattern detector in that sense. It sees creation. And anytime it sees itself as part of that creation, it delights in all of that. Because it now perceives itself as a co-creator in that journey. And so it goes searching all of creation. That's its primary impulse. That's the primary impulse of Leo. It goes searching all of creation, looking for images of itself, so it can delight in it. Okay? Now, at some point it begins to search the head of other human beings. Because other human beings are now within its field of experience. And so it must search the head, the internal awareness of other human beings to connect with them. And it is Virgo that allows it to begin on that journey, to connect with another human being's reality. And so what that simply means is that all the fractals, all human beings are carrying this fractal nature of self-similarity, where all of you are me and all of us are you. Because that is the actual relationship between us and God. There's really no difference, no distance really. And so space-time doesn't really exist. This is the conviction that sits within the fourth house. Because it is this conviction that allows you to know where you are, who you are, where you're coming from, and as a result of that, where you're going. When Saturn finds itself in the fourth house, it blocks all of this. And so the third house, or the sign of Gemini, cannot proceed into the ego that Leo is. It is blocked in the fourth, or it is blocked in the sign of Cancer. And so conviction cannot sit within this person. And so the person goes around without encountering a figurative foundation to their psychology. And this shows up in many ways, because convictions build realities. And so it may show up as a person who is very unstable. And the instability is that familiar patterns cannot sit within the person. Once things begin to become familiar to a certain threshold, the individual undoes the entire process. And Saturn in the fourth house, or in the sign of Cancer, is such a strategic placement. It is always tied to the life story as a huge statement because of what the fourth house symbolizes. Because when things go wrong in the fourth house, then it's like the floor disappearing beneath you. It's a sense of just falling into aimlessness or nothingness, really. And the psyche has different ways of dealing with this type of thing. They may be unstable in terms of foundation, in terms of what you call a home or familiar environments. But where the instability really lies is that the person is dissociated from themselves. And Saturn in the 4th house, or Saturn in the sign of Cancer, is always indicative of a person running away from their own truth because it terrifies them. There is something in the truth of their existence that they cannot accept. And so by denying that truth, they deny their self-acceptance. And so self-acceptance becomes self-negation. And then convictions, which birth realities, are translated into anti-convictions, which are entirely built on falsehood. And so the individual now finds themselves creating various versions of falsehoods as a way of defending the ego. So the shell that the crab has now encompasses many layers, but every layer is false. And so what happens, because without correction, and this is a very damaging process, what happens is that there are usually compensatory structures within a natal chart designed to terminate these falsehoods at some point before they become so dangerous. Because once they cross a certain threshold, then the individual really has no reason to be anymore. Because you are not here to erect a falsehood. You are here to answer a question that began before you were born. The question is so powerful, it births a universe. It begins what you eventually call a physical experience. That's how powerful it is. So that every such question, because the divine question is a question posed at the divine. And I have a podcast, a new podcast. It's still sitting behind my YouTube firewall. It's for my members only for now. That talks about the Abrahamic covenant with God. You know, at that stage, it's still called Avram. So Avram made a covenant with God, or God made a covenant with Avram. All right. And I translate this into a different perspective entirely. Because covenants are 4th house phenomenons. Why? Because the aim of conviction is to create a covenant. It's a covenant that births the ego. And this takes place in the seat of conviction. And the seat of conviction, I've said many times in many podcasts, that's what in the religious text it is called the Ark of the Covenant. Go look at the symbolism used to describe the Ark of the Covenant. That is a figurative statement regarding the seat of conviction that exists in every human. It is the most sacred aspect of human psyche. Why? Because convictions birth realities. So anything that sits in the seat of conviction, that's what becomes a reality. So when you alter conviction, and this is not a process that happens because you want to alter conviction, it's not amenable to the will. Okay? Because your self-understanding at that point is below the birth of the ego in that sense. But once you can alter convictions, and convictions are based on evidence, once you can alter them, then the reality as it appears in front of you also is altered. Because it's only a product of your convictions. Okay? So there is a certain quality about the type of narrative that defines a conviction. And it is based on that Avraham, when the name changed from Avram to Avraham, it became necessary to implement the covenant. And how was it implemented? It was implemented as circumcision, which is a cutting off of the foreskin of the male phallus. Why do you think that's the case? Because that's what happens in Scorpio. Because you can imagine that in the 4th house, conviction is blocked. But that shows up in Scorpio as the inability to form authentic, genuine, intimate relationships. Because you think you are forming them with other people, but the reality of the matter is that you are not. And I have podcasts that talk about that, especially the podcast on the nature of paradise, the ascent of infinite knowing. That's not behind the firewall. You can listen to it. Okay? Because when the human male child is born, the phallus is completely enveloped. It is covered. This is symbolic of the figurative, the symbolic angels that sit on the Ark of the Covenant. You know, the cherubim. The imagery is like that of children. But it has 6 wings. And there's some wings that cover the cherubim. This covering is symbolic of the fact that the seat of conviction is the most guarded place in human psyche. The idea is to open it up. But it cannot be opened up because you command it to open up. That's not the way that it works. It's the point where human beings feel the greatest fear, the most vulnerable. The only thing that can open it up is the absence of fear, the true absence of fear that is based on conviction. And when that happens, everything else opens up. The 8th house also opens up. The 8th house is where that fear actually goes to manifest. Okay? Or in Scorpio. And that fear that enclosure that is created by that fear of vulnerability or that fear of being vulnerable, that's what is symbolized by the covering, the natural covering on the phallus of the human male child. And so circumcision becomes a way to assert the uncovering of that truth, because it goes back to the narrative, the symbolic narratives of how the proverbial human Adam was hiding himself from God, because he became convinced that there was something wrong with him. The conviction was based on evidence. So you can see that the conviction itself diminished him, the proverbial human, and sent him into hiding. That process created distance. It created time, because space and time really is the recognition or the awareness that you are separate from something. And so began the journey. The journey has always been to reconcile this distance, to collapse it all, to close it up, because it doesn't exist really. And so people with Saturn in the 4th house or in the sign of Cancer, they feel distance more than others. The loneliness that is experienced by people with this type of placement is not something you can easily define. Even they couldn't tell you how crushing such a loneliness is. Because it's not a loneliness that is created because they are devoid of human contact. No. Usually these people are found amongst many people. It's a matter of truth. Nobody really knows who they are. And as a result of that, they don't know who they are. And so it is a natural emanation of the process of denial. That's really what it is. It's a deep loneliness, a deep aloneness. And that creates a sense of isolation, a very true sense of isolation, of being cut off. But what it really is that the human is hiding. And they're hiding because they are afraid. They're hiding because they feel so vulnerable. Okay? And so all the emanations for physical contact and intimacy, they're all built on falsehoods. Because nobody really knows who they are, because they don't know who they are. And so there are a lot of conflicts. There's so many conflictual situations that arise. And it's like a treadmill. It just keeps cycling around. And in order to further protect the psyche from what is going on, the individual invents the narratives to support those conflicts. Oh, they're all against me. They hate me. Or they don't want me to do this, or they don't want me to do that. But, you know, like I said, the narratives are circling around in the person's own experience. So it is the person's experience. It's what the person is telling itself. And based on the fact that it is an anti-conviction, then such an anti-reality is what develops. And the individual cannot find acceptance. So they go looking for that acceptance in the physical world. And usually the resolution for this starts when the individual is able to implement something in Capricorn, which is the sign that sits opposite the sign of Cancer, or in the 10th house. And so that's the way to understand the placement of Saturn in the 4th. You cannot form foundations, familiar foundations, early in life. And so it scars you in a sense. And so it forces you to seek external validation. It forces you to seek social acceptance as a remedy for the lack of self-acceptance you literally inherited, because it was no fault of yours. You were born into those types of constraints because it forms part of your life story. It really couldn't have been any other way. Like I said, if you want to make some type of meal, you have to bring in the right ingredients. And not all the ingredients are sweet. Some are downright bitter. But if their taste, their particular flavor is missing from the meal, then the taste of the meal may just be flat. Okay? This is complex systems thinking, because it is within that type of thinking that you begin to understand that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's why I wrote the 5 principles of organized complexity, because I wanted to explain all of reality in this way, a way that transcends the pure intellectual format, a way that connects to the emotive, because the emotive is a part that already exists. It exists, and it's far more complex than the purely rational side of human nature. Far more complex. It can also do much more, because that is what defines us as human beings. And so when Saturn is in the 4th house, that emotive aspect is initially blocked. The individual just simply cannot respond in that way. But it does not mean that they are not sensitive. They simply cannot respond. But when you're not allowed to do something simple, then you end up doing something very complex. And so the individual sensitivity is buried so deep. So deep. They no longer can feel that it is there. And yet it appears to them as if they are falling through meaninglessness, nothingness really. And so they may indulge in ways or different methods of assuaging this feeling. It's easy to become addicted with Saturn in the 4th house, because this is not a feeling that you can function with. This feeling of hopelessness and aloneness and whatever. It eats the individual up from inside, because the pressure, the aim of the pressure in most natal charts where you find this configuration, the aim of the pressure is to focus on social acceptance. And to do that in a way that is tangible and concrete, that means you must build something, you must create something, so that when people socially accept that thing, it begins to heal the aspect of the self that is denied that self-acceptance from childhood. That's really what it is. Okay? That's really, really what it is. And so if you have this placement, you have to understand that it's a very difficult placement. And this has nothing to do with whether you did something or you didn't do. It has nothing to do with that. There is no blame here, but you cannot shake the feeling of guilt, the feeling of shame that has burdened you your entire life because you feel as if you've done something wrong. You're really just carrying a weight that is reminiscent of some type of inheritance. It's time to put the bricks down. Put the weight down. Because the reason why you have that weight or that burden or whatever you want to call it is because you need to compensate that feeling with ownership. Because that is now your vehicle for worthiness. Because what has been missing your entire life is the sense of worthiness. I am worthy. And that is reminiscent of acceptance. Because when you scale everything up, it is the magnification really of this inability to accept the self. One reason or the other, usually manifested as something impaired with the primary caregiver, especially mother. Okay? So that's really what it is. Now, when this Saturn is placed in the 4th house or in the sign of Cancer, the inability of this person to accept themselves, the result is self-rejection. Because the self-rejection is the anti-conviction. And that is what is brought into existence. But how does this show up? It shows up as a duality in the sense that the self is split into two at a minimum, and one aspect of the self accuses the other aspect of the self, and they trade accusations back and forth. And the thing that is being used in the accusatory process is the dynamic that is taking place in the seat of conviction, because that is the nature of the opposition. And by the time it begins to manifest in the sign of Libra or in the 7th house, it shows up as a person constantly being accused by others of one thing or the other. Or it shows up as this person accusing others of one thing or the other. The essential part is that the conflict is externalized. And the nature of this conflict is such that it is entirely based on envy. Because envy is the manifestation of this self-rejection. And so those with Saturn in the 4th house are prone to a tremendous amount of envy. Now, the envy itself doesn't really manifest in 4th house matters. It shows up in 8th house matters. Okay? That's really how it manifests. And this self-rejection is not an entirely bad thing, like I've said, because it may be the ingredient that is necessary to create the externalization process that must now happen in the 10th house or in the sign of Capricorn. So there is no good or bad to these things per se. Okay? It depends on what the overall structure is. Now, it depends on what is receiving this part of the psyche and what is being done with it. If this part of the psyche is being used as some type of raw material to erect a different hierarchy or a different layer of structure. So it's not entirely a good or bad thing per se. It may be dysfunctional, but sometimes the dysfunctionality is used to create a desire that now walks towards some type of function somewhere. Okay? That's really how it is. But before this dysfunction can be understood, it is the sense of envy that is created from that dysfunction. That's what now manifests. And, envy is such a funny kind of emotion in how destructive it can be. But envy always leads to some type of alienation, because the one that you are envious of is the one that is ahead of you in that sense. But there is no other one. You see, that's what you would like to be, but you are not. And it is that awareness that is the nature of envy. And once you implement some type of cruelty or some type of wickedness or some type of thing to hurt the one that you consider to be ahead of you, then you have implemented the awareness that you are behind that person. And as long as you have implemented it, you have undone yourself, because now by your own hands, you have confirmed your deepest fears. And what that simply means is that until a rectification process occurs, you will always be behind that person. That means that the self will remain split in that accusatory mode, trading accusations back and forth within the psyche. That's the absence of peace. And so it becomes impossible to manifest the stability that the psyche needs in order to be able to form a foundation. So the person appears like a wanderer here and there, unable to settle down into anything really, because of the extreme dynamism that is taking place in a place where there should be calm. And as a result of that, what is necessary to free the person is a rectification, a reconciliation. But it's not a reconciliation between you and someone else or you and something else. It's a reconciliation between you and yourself. Because it is a reconciliation in its highest form. It is a reconciliation between you and God. That's really what it is. Now, like I've said earlier, these are not individual narratives, okay? They are part of a natal synthesis. And so it is important to understand how this aspect fits into the broader narrative that is already encoded within a natal chart. And that way you can find the meaning, the true purpose. It's always a singular purpose, always a singular narrative. No matter how complex it is, it's always a singular narrative. It is a singular narrative that brings souls into the human experience. That's really what it is. Okay. But until that happens, the individual conceals their shame, their guilt, the fact that they have no confidence in themselves, the fact that they really feel unworthy to receive. They feel unworthy to receive the highest expressions of themselves. But you wouldn't know this because they conceal it behind shells. Shells of fraud. Inauthentic ways of being. Okay? And then they have to maintain these shells. It's an arduous task because it's like trying to control many levers at the same time. But that is the process of denial. That is the system of denial. And it represents a bondage system because the individual cannot leave that system without the rectification, without the reconciliation. They simply are trapped in it. It's a stronghold. And this is the big, huge problem of Saturn in the 4th house or in the sign of Cancer. You usually find those same patterns when the moon is in aspect to Saturn. Okay? But like I said, and I keep saying this so that it's clear, this is not necessarily a bad thing until it is integrated into the full narrative of the natal chart. Okay? It's only at that level that you can tell the nature of the dysfunction, whether it's really antagonistic to the self, or whether it's the raw material for some further processing within the natal chart. Okay? So don't just listen to this and assume that, oh, I have Saturn in the 4th house or in the sign of Cancer. That means it's all bad. That means it's this or that. That's not the way to listen to these podcasts. The aim of this podcast is to help you to internally reflect if you need natal chart synthesis or not. And if you need natal chart synthesis, then you should plan on getting one. Every time is the right time. A human being should always be kind to themselves because you're really up against it. That's the entire point of being a human, is dealing with this ignorance of what it is to be a being. Because in my podcast, Paradise, the infinite ascent of knowing, what we are originally has no ignorance in it. We know everything. And that knowing everything is constantly growing. And so it's an infinite ascent towards God. Unity with God, this intimacy with God. And it goes on forever. Okay? Now, when we are born as human beings, we don't know anything. We're just born with these drives, because that thing which we're supposed to know is usually encoded within us in ways that we can't understand as these drives and motives. The aim of natal chart synthesis is to begin to read what those drives are. Because we're not entirely a blank slate, but we're born into ignorance. That's what it means to be a child, to be an infant, to be born. It is the birth of ignorance. And we spend, I don't know how many years, a couple of decades, just trying to realize what or who we are. Okay? That's the whole thing. It's the nature of our space and time. It's the nature of what we call physicality. Because that nature of space-time, it hides knowledge. It conceals things. So that you can look at another human being and you have no idea what you're looking at. The quintessential example of this situation is what you call racism. Now you're beginning to understand. Because the period of human awareness where this type of system or this racism emerged is the period of peak ignorance within the human. It is symptomatic of the state of human consciousness. And that's why I made the podcast on Genesis 15, Abraham and his covenant with God. It's a new podcast. It's barely a week old, but it's a very important podcast because it goes into great detail about how this entire process of the fourth house and everything, how it really works, where it's coming from. Because Avram really is that Sagittarian principle. You know, the Sagittarian principle? That's really what it is. It's a very deep podcast. My contact details are always in my podcast, in the descriptions of my podcasts. You can reach out and that will send you to my webpage where you can make your booking and you can request your natal chart synthesis. You know, the process is completely private in that sense and your details are secure. And there's also a part of my website where you can read what other people are saying. Now, I don't actively solicit feedback from clients. I don't. But if you want to express something about your synthesis or you want to say something else regarding anything else, no problem. So anytime you want to get your synthesis, that's the right time. When you are ready, you will know.